Welcome back to Footnotes Folly and to Josephus's Antiquities. I am Pemberton. This is Book 7 Part 2. First the Empire. We watch David subdue the Philistines, the Moabites, the Syrians and the Ammonites, until tribute flows in from every side and Israel is the great power of the region. And then, at the very summit, the fall. While his army besieges the Ammonite capital, David stays home, and from his rooftop one evening he sees a beautiful woman bathing Bathsheba, another man's wife. We will tell it plainly: the adultery, the attempted cover-up, and the cold arranging of the death of her husband Uriah, one of David's own loyal soldiers. We will hear the prophet Nathan spring his trap of a parable: you are the man, and pronounce the doom that the sword shall never leave David's house. And we will watch the doom begin at once, inside his own family, with the crime of his son Amnon against his daughter Tamar. Let us take up the story.
A little while after this, David considered that he ought to make war against the Philistines, and that he should not allow any idleness or laziness in his government. In this way, as God had foretold him, after he had overthrown his enemies, he would leave his posterity to reign in peace afterward. So he called his army together again. When he had ordered them to be ready and prepared for war, and when he thought that everything in the army was in good condition, he left Jerusalem and came against the Philistines. He defeated them in battle, cut off a large part of their country, and joined it to the land of the Hebrews. Then he carried the war over to the Moabites. After he defeated 2 parts of their army in battle, he took the remaining part captive and imposed tribute on them, to be paid every year. David then made war against Hadadezer, the son of Rehob, king of Sophene. When he joined battle with him at the river Euphrates, he destroyed 20,000 of his foot soldiers and about 7,000 of his horsemen. He also captured 1,000 of his chariots, destroyed the greater part of them, and ordered that no more than 100 should be kept. When Hadad, king of Damascus and of Syria, heard that David was fighting against Hadadezer, who was his friend, he came to help him with a powerful army, hoping to rescue him. But when he joined battle with David at the river Euphrates, he failed in his purpose and lost a great number of soldiers in the battle. 20,000 men of Hadad's army were killed, and all the rest fled. Nislands of Damascus also mentions this king in the 4th book of his histories. He says that a long time after these things happened, there was a man of that country named Hadad, who became very powerful. He reigned over Damascus and the other parts of Syria, except Phoenicia. He made war against David, the king of Judea, and tried his fortune in many battles, especially in the last battle at Euphrates, where he was defeated. He seemed to be the most excellent of all their kings in strength and courage. Nislands also says of Hadad's descendants that they succeeded one another in his kingdom and in his name. When Hadad died, his posterity reigned for 10 generations, each successor receiving from his father both his dominion and his name, as the Ptolemies did in Egypt. But the third of them was the most powerful of all, and he wanted to avenge the defeat his forefather had suffered. So he made an expedition against the Jews, and laid waste the city now called Samaria. Nor was Nislands mistaken about the truth, for this was the Hadad who made the expedition against Samaria in the reign of Ahab, king of Israel, whom we shall discuss later in the proper place. After David made an expedition against Damascus and the other parts of Syria, brought all of it into subjection, placed garrisons in the country, and appointed that they should pay tribute, he returned home. He also dedicated to God at Jerusalem the golden quivers, the complete armor that Hadad's guards used to wear. Shishak, the king of Egypt, later carried these away when he fought against David's grandson Rehoboam, together with a great deal of other wealth that he took out of Jerusalem. These things will be explained later in their proper places. As for the king of the Hebrews, he was helped by God, who gave him great success in his wars. David made an expedition against the best cities of Hadadezer, Bida and Machen. He took them by force and laid them waste. In them he found a very great quantity of gold and silver, along with that kind of brass which is said to be more valuable than gold. From this brass Solomon made the large vessel called the Brazen Sea, and also the most finely made lavers, when he built the temple for God. When the king of Hamath learned of Hadadezer's failure and heard of the ruin of his army, he became afraid for himself. He decided to make a league of friendship and fidelity with David before David came against him. So he sent his son Joram to David and declared that he owed David thanks for fighting against Hadadezer, who was his enemy, and he made a league with David of mutual assistance and friendship. He also sent him gifts, vessels of ancient workmanship made of gold, silver, and brass. After David made this league of mutual assistance with Toi, for that was the name of the king of Hamath, and received the presents he had sent, he dismissed Toi's son with the respect due from both sides. Then David brought the gifts sent by Toi, along with the rest of the gold and silver he had taken from the cities he had conquered, and dedicated them to God. God did not give victory and success to David only when he went into battle himself and led his own army. He also gave victory to Abishai, the brother of Joab and general of David's forces, over the Idumeans, and through Abishai gave victory to David when David sent him with an army into Idumea. Abishai destroyed 18,000 of them in battle. After this, the king of Israel placed garrisons throughout all Idumea and received tribute from the country and from every person among them. David was by nature just and made his decisions according to truth. Joab was general over his whole army. He made Jehoshaphat the son of Ahilud recorder. He appointed Zadok, of the family of Phinehas, to be high priest together with Abiathar, because Abiathar was his friend. He also made Sasan the scribe and gave command over his bodyguards to Benaiah, the son of Jehoiada. His elder son stayed near his person and also had care of him. David also remembered the covenants and oaths he had made with Jonathan, the son of Saul, and the friendship and affection Jonathan had shown him. Along with all the other excellent qualities he possessed, David was especially mindful of those who had once done him good. He therefore ordered an inquiry to be made to find out whether anyone from Jonathan's family was still alive, so that he might repay the close friendship Jonathan had shown him, and for which David still considered himself in debt. One of Saul's freedmen was brought to him, a man who knew which members of Saul's family were still living. David asked whether he knew of anyone belonging to Jonathan who was still alive and capable of receiving repayment for the benefits David had received from Jonathan. The man said that one son of Jonathan remained, whose name was Mephibosheth, but that he was lame in his feet. When his nurse heard that the child's father and grandfather had fallen in battle, she snatched him up and fled away, but let him fall from her shoulders, and his feet were crippled. When David learned where Mephibosheth was and by whom he was being raised, he sent messengers to Machir in the city of Lodebar, because Jonathan's son was being brought up with him, and summoned Mephibosheth to come to him. When Mephibosheth came to the king, he fell on his face and worshipped him. But David encouraged him, told him to be of good cheer, and told him to expect better times. He gave him his father's house, and all the estate that his grandfather Saul had possessed. He also told him to come and dine at his own table, and never be absent from that table for a single day. When the young man worshipped him because of his words, and the gifts given to him, David called for Ziba, and told him that he had given the youth his father's house, and all Saul's estate. He also ordered Ziba to cultivate his land, take care of it, and bring all its profits to Jerusalem. Accordingly, David brought Mephibosheth to his table every day, and bestowed on the youth Ziba and Ziba's 15 sons and 20 servants. When the king had made these arrangements, Ziba worshipped him and promised to do everything he had commanded. Then Ziba went away. So this son of Jonathan lived at Jerusalem, ate at the king's table, and received the same care that a son could claim. He himself also had a son, whom he named Micah. These were the honors that David gave to those who remained from the line of Saul and Jonathan. About this time Nahash, the king of the Ammonites and a friend of David, died. When his son succeeded his father in the kingdom, David sent ambassadors to him to comfort him. He urged him to bear his father's death patiently, and to expect that David would continue showing him the same kindness he had shown to his father. But the princes of the Ammonites took this message badly, not in the spirit of kindness with which David had sent it. They stirred up the king to resent it, saying that David had sent men under the pretense of humanity and kindness in order to spy out the country and learn what strength it had. They further advised him to be careful and not pay attention to David's words, or else he might be deceived by him and fall into an incurable disaster. Accordingly, Nahash's son, the king of the Ammonites, thought that these princes had spoken what seemed more likely than the truth aloud. He therefore abused the ambassadors in a very harsh way. He shaved off 1/2 of their beards, cut off 1/2 of their garments, and sent his answer not in words but in deeds. When the king of Israel saw this, he was indignant and made it openly clear that he would not overlook such insulting and shameful treatment. He would make war against the Ammonites and avenge on their king this wicked treatment of his ambassadors. When that king's close friends and commanders understood that they had violated their league and were liable to be punished for it, they made preparations for war. They also sent 1,000 talents to the Syrian king of Mesopotamia and tried to persuade him, for that pay and Shobach, to assist them. These kings had 20,000 foot soldiers. They also hired the king of the country called Maacah, and a fourth king named Ishtab, who had 12,000 armed men. But David was not frightened by this alliance or by the forces of the Ammonites. He put his trust in God, because he was going to war for a just cause, on account of the insulting treatment he had received. He immediately sent Joab, the captain of his army, against them, and gave him the finest part of his forces. Joab camped by Rabbah, the chief city of the Ammonites. The enemy then came out and arranged themselves for battle, not all together, but in 2 bodies. The auxiliaries were drawn up by themselves in the plain, while the army of the Ammonites stood at the gates opposite the Hebrews. When Joab saw this, he set one stratagem against another. He chose the hardiest part of his men, and placed them opposite the king of Syria and the kings who were with him. He gave the other part to his brother Abishai, and told him to set them opposite the Ammonites. Joab told Abishai that if he saw the Syrians pressing Joab hard and proving too strong for him, he should order his troops to turn around and help him. Joab said that he himself would do the same for Abishai if he saw him in similar distress from the Ammonites. Then Joab sent his brother forward and encouraged him to do everything bravely and eagerly, in a way that would teach them to fear disgrace and fight with courage. So he sent Abishai to fight the Ammonites, while Joab himself attacked the Syrians. Although the Syrians resisted strongly for a while, Joab killed many of them and forced the rest to flee. When the Ammonites saw this, and were also afraid of Abishai and his army, they did not remain any longer. They followed the example of their auxiliaries and fled into the city. After Joab had overcome the enemy in this way, he returned with great joy to the king at Jerusalem. This defeat still did not make the Ammonites quiet, nor did it make them acknowledge that those who were superior to them really were superior and remain at peace. Instead, they sent to Chalaman, the king of the Syrians beyond Euphrates, and hired him as an auxiliary. He had Shobach as captain of his army, with 80,000 foot soldiers and 10,000 horsemen. When the king of the Hebrews learned that the Ammonites had again gathered such a great army, he decided no longer to make war on them through his generals. Instead, he himself crossed the river Jordan with all his army. When he met them, he joined battle with them, defeated them, and killed 40,000 of their foot soldiers and 7,000 of their horsemen. He also wounded Shobach, the general of Chalaman's forces, and Shobach died from that wound. After the battle ended in this way, the people of Mesopotamia surrendered themselves to David and sent him gifts. David returned to Jerusalem in the winter, but at the beginning of spring he sent Joab, the captain of his army, to fight against the Ammonites. Joab overran all their country, laid it waste, shut them up in their capital city Rabbah, and besieged them there. David now fell into a very serious sin, though he was otherwise naturally a righteous and religious man, and one who firmly kept the laws of our fathers. Late one evening, while he was looking around from the roof of his royal palace, where he usually walked at that hour, he saw a woman washing herself in her own house. She was extraordinarily beautiful and surpassed all other women in beauty. Her name was Bathsheba. David was overcome by the woman's beauty and could not restrain his desire. He sent for her and lay with her. After this, she conceived a child and sent word to the king, asking him to devise some way to conceal her sin, for according to the laws of their fathers, a woman guilty of adultery ought to be put to death. So the king sent for Joab's armor-bearer from the siege, who was the woman's husband, and whose name was Uriah. When Uriah came, the king asked him about the army and about the siege. Uriah answered that all their affairs were going as they wished. Then the king took portions of food from his own supper, gave them to him, and told him to go home to his wife and rest with her. But Uriah did not do so. Instead, he slept near the king with the rest of his armor-bearers. When the king was told this, he asked Uriah why, after such a long absence, he had not gone home to his house and his wife, as all men naturally do when they return from a long journey. Uriah replied that it was not right for him to go and rest and comfort himself with his wife while his fellow soldiers and the general of the army were sleeping on the ground in the camp and in an enemy's country. After Uriah gave this answer, the king ordered him to stay there that night, saying that he would send him back to the general the next day. The king then invited Uriah to supper, and in a cunning and skillful way kept giving him drink during the meal until he was disordered by it. Yet even then Uriah slept at the king's gates, and showed no inclination to go to his wife. At this the king was very angry with him. David wrote to Joab and ordered him to punish Uriah, saying that Uriah had offended him. He also suggested the manner in which he wanted him punished, so that it would not be discovered that David himself was the author of the punishment. He commanded Joab to set Uriah opposite the part of the enemy's army where the attack would be most dangerous, where he could be deserted and placed in the greatest peril, and to order his fellow soldiers to withdraw from the fight. After writing this and sealing the letter with his own seal, David gave it to Uriah to carry to Joab. When Joab received it, and on reading it, understood the king's purpose, he placed Uriah in the spot where he knew the enemy would be most troublesome to them. He assigned some of the best soldiers in the army to stand with him, and said that he too would come to their assistance with the whole army, so that, if possible, they might break down some part of the wall and enter the city. He urged Uriah to be glad for the chance to expose himself to such great hardship, and not to be displeased by it, since he was a brave soldier and had a great reputation for courage both with the king and with his countrymen. When Uriah eagerly undertook the work assigned to him, Joab gave private orders to those who were to be his companions that, when they saw the enemy make a sally, they should leave him. When the Hebrews attacked the city, the Ammonites feared that the enemy might get ahead of them and climb into the city at the very place where Uriah had been stationed. So they put their best soldiers in the front, suddenly opened their gates, and attacked the enemy with great force, rushing violently against them. When the men with Uriah saw this, they all drew back, as Joab had ordered them beforehand. But Uriah was ashamed to run away and abandon his post. He stood against the enemy and received the force of their assault. He killed many of them, but when he was surrounded and caught in the middle of them, he was killed, and some of his companions were killed with him. After this was done, Joab sent messengers to the king and ordered them to tell him that he had done all he could to take the city quickly, but that when they assaulted the wall they had been forced to withdraw with great loss. He told them that if they saw the king become angry at this, they should add that Uriah had also been killed. When the king heard the report from the messengers, he took it badly and said that they had done wrong in assaulting the wall. They should instead have tried to take the city by undermining it and by other military stratagems, especially since they had before their eyes the example of Abimelech, the son of Gideon, who insisted on taking the tower in Thebes by force, and was killed by a large stone thrown at him by an old woman. Though Abimelech was a man of great strength, he died shamefully because of the dangerous manner of his attack. David said they ought to remember this event, and not come near the enemy's wall, for the best way to make war successfully was to remember what had happened in former wars, and what good or bad results had followed in similar dangerous situations, so that they might imitate the good and avoid the bad. But while the king was in this state of mind, the messenger told him that Uriah had also been killed. Then David was pacified. He He told the messenger to go back to Joab and say that this misfortune was nothing more than what is common among mankind, for such is the nature and such are the accidents of war. Sometimes the enemy succeeds in it, and sometimes others do. But he ordered Joab to continue taking care of the siege, so that no further evil accident would befall him in it. They were to raise bulwarks and use engines in besieging the city, and when they had taken it, they were to overturn its very foundations and destroy everyone in it. The messenger carried the king's message as he had been charged and hurried back to Joab. Bathsheba, the wife of Uriah, when she was told of her husband's death, mourned for him many days. When her mourning was finished and the tears she had shed for Uriah were dried, the king immediately took her as his wife, and she bore him a son. God was not pleased with this marriage, but was angry at David because of it. He appeared to Nathan the prophet in his sleep and complained of the king. Nathan was a fair and prudent man. Since he considered that kings, when they fall into passion, are guided more by passion than by justice, he resolved to conceal the threats that came from God and instead spoke to David in a gentle way. He asked the king to give his judgment about a certain case. There were 2 men living in the same city, one rich and the other poor. The rich man had many flocks of cattle, sheep, and oxen. But the poor man had only one ewe lamb. He brought it up with his children and let it eat its food with them, and he had for it the same natural affection that anyone might have for a daughter. Now when a stranger came to the rich man, he would not consent to kill anything from his own flocks to make a feast for his friend. Instead, he sent for the poor man's lamb, took her away from him, prepared her for food, and feasted the stranger with her. This account troubled the king exceedingly. He declared to Nathan that the man who dared to do such a thing was wicked, and that it was only just for him to restore the lamb fourfold and also be punished with death. At this Nathan immediately said that David himself was the man who ought to suffer those punishments, according to his own sentence, and that David was the one who had committed this great and horrible crime. Nathan also revealed and set before him the anger of God against him. God had made him king over the army of the Hebrews and lord over all the nations, including the many great nations around him. God had formerly delivered him out of the hands of Saul, and had given him the wives he had justly and lawfully married. Yet now David had despised this God and insulted him by his impiety, when he married and now possessed another man's wife, and when, by exposing her husband to the enemy, he had in truth killed him. God would inflict punishments on him because of these wicked deeds. His own wives would be forced by one of his sons, and he would be treacherously supplanted by that same son. Although David had committed his wickedness secretly, the punishment he would undergo would be inflicted publicly upon him. Nathan also said that the child born to him from her would soon die. When the king was troubled by these messages and sufficiently confounded, he said with tears and sorrow that he had sinned. For beyond dispute he was a pious man and guilty of no sin at all in his whole life except in the matter of Uriah. God had compassion on him, was reconciled to him, and promised to preserve both his life and his kingdom, saying that because David had repented of what he had done, God was no longer displeased with him. After Nathan delivered this prophecy to the king, he returned home. Nevertheless, God sent a dangerous sickness upon the child who had been born to David from the wife of Uriah. The king was deeply troubled and took no food for 7 days, although his servants almost forced him to eat. He clothed himself in a black garment, fell down, and lay on the ground in sackcloth, entrusting the child's recovery to God, for he greatly loved the child's mother. But on the 7th day the child died. The king's servants did not dare tell him, supposing that if he knew it, he would be even less willing to accept food or care for himself because of his grief over his son's death, since he had afflicted himself so greatly in grief for him while the child was only sick. But when the king noticed that his servants were disturbed and seemed affected like people who very much wanted to hide something, he understood that the child was dead. He called one of his servants to him and learned that it was so. Then he got up, washed himself, put on a white garment, and came into the tabernacle of God. He also ordered them to set supper before him. This greatly surprised his kindred and servants, since he had done none of this while the child was sick, but did all of it after the child was dead. So, after first asking permission to question him, they begged him to explain the reason for his conduct. He called them unskillful people and instructed them that while the child was alive he had hoped for the child's recovery, and therefore did everything proper for him to do, thinking that by such means he might make God favorable to him. But once the child was dead, there was no longer any reason for grief, since it would then serve no purpose. When he had said this, they praised the king's wisdom and understanding. Then he went into Bathsheba his wife, and she conceived and bore a son. By the command of Nathan the prophet, he called his name Solomon. Meanwhile Joab severely distressed the Ammonites during the siege by cutting off their water and depriving them of other means of subsistence, until they were in the greatest need of food and drink. They depended on only one small well of water, and they did not dare drink from it too freely, for fear that the spring would entirely fail them. So Joab wrote to the king and informed him of this. He urged David to come himself to take the city, so that David might have the honor of the victory. On receiving Joab's letter, the king accepted his goodwill and faithfulness, took his army with him, and came for the destruction of Rabbah. When he had taken it by force, he gave it to his soldiers to plunder. But he himself took the crown of the king of the Ammonites, whose weight was a talent of gold, and which had in its center a precious stone called a sardonyx. David wore this crown on his own head ever afterward. He also found many other vessels in the city, splendid and of great price. As for the men, he tormented them, and then destroyed them. When he had taken the other cities of the Ammonites by force, he treated them in the same way. When the king returned to Jerusalem, a sad misfortune came upon his house in the following way. He had a daughter who was still a virgin and very beautiful, so much so that she surpassed all the most beautiful women. Her name was Tamar, and she had the same mother as Absalom. Amnon, David's eldest son, fell in love with her. Because she was a virgin and was carefully guarded, he could not obtain what he desired. He became so disturbed, and his grief so consumed his body, that he grew thin and his color changed. Now there was a man named Jenadab, his kinsman and friend, who discovered his passion, for Jenadab was extraordinarily wise and very shrewd in mind. When he saw every morning that Amnon was not in the bodily condition he ought to be, he came to him and asked him to tell him the cause of it. He said, however, that he guessed it came from the passion of love. Amnon confessed his passion and said that he was in love with a sister of his, who had the same father as himself. So Jenadab suggested a method and scheme by which he might obtain his desire. He persuaded him to pretend to be sick, and told him that when his father came to him, he should beg that his sister might come and take care of him. If that happened, he said, Amnon would be better and would quickly recover from his illness. So Amnon lay down on his bed and pretended to be sick, just as Jonadab had suggested. When his father came and asked how he was, Amnon begged him to send his sister to him. David immediately ordered her to be brought to him. When Tamar came, Amnon told her to make cakes for him, fry them in a pan, and do it all with her own hands, because he would receive them better from her hand than from anyone else's. So she kneaded the flour in her brother's sight, made the cakes, baked them in a pan, and brought them to him. But at that time he would not taste them. Instead, he ordered his servants to send everyone who was there out of his chamber, because he wanted to rest without noise or disturbance. As soon as his command had been carried out, he asked his sister to bring his supper to him into the inner room. When the young woman had done this, he took hold of her and tried to persuade her to lie with him. The young woman cried out and told him not to force her, and not to be so wicked as to violate the laws and bring the greatest shame on himself. She urged him to restrain his unrighteous and impure desire, from which their house would gain nothing but reproach and disgrace. She also advised him to speak to his father about the matter, saying that he would allow him to marry her. She said this because she wanted, for the present, to escape her brother's violent passion. But he would not listen to her. Inflamed with love and blinded by the force of his desire, he forced his sister. As soon as Amnon had satisfied his lust, he immediately hated her. He spoke reproachfully to her and told her to get up and leave. She said that this treatment was more injurious than the first, if after forcing her he would not let her stay with him until evening, but ordered her away in the daytime and in the light, where she might meet people who would witness her shame. But he commanded his servant to put her out of his house. Tamar was deeply grieved by the injury and violence done to her. She tore her loose coat, for in former times virgins wore such loose coats, tied at the hands and hanging down to the ankles, so that the inner garments would not be seen. She sprinkled ashes on her head and went through the middle of the city, crying out and lamenting the violence that had been done to her. Absalom, her brother, happened to meet her and asked what sad thing had happened to her that she was in such a condition. When she told him what injury had been done to her, he comforted her and asked her to be quiet, to bear everything patiently, and not to regard it as an injury that she had been corrupted by her brother. She yielded to his advice, stopped crying out, and ceased revealing the force done to her before the multitude. She remained as a widow with her brother Absalom for a long time. When David her father learned of this, he was grieved by Amnon's actions. But because he had an extraordinary affection for Amnon, since he was his eldest son, he was compelled not to afflict him. Absalom, however, watched for a suitable opportunity to avenge this crime upon him, for he thoroughly hated him. In the 2nd year after this wicked affair concerning his sister had passed, Absalom was about to go shear his sheep at Balhazer, a city in the portion of Ephraim. He begged his father, as well as his brothers, to come and feast with him. But David excused himself because he did not want to be burdensome to him. Absalom then asked that he at least send his brothers, and David sent them accordingly. Absalom then commanded his servants that when they saw Amnon disordered and drowsy with wine, and when Absalom gave them a signal, they should fear no one, but kill him. When they did as they had been commanded, the rest of his brothers were astonished and disturbed, and feared for themselves. They immediately mounted their horses and rode away to their father. But someone went ahead of them and told their father that all of them had been killed by Absalom. David was overcome with sorrow, as though so many of his sons had been destroyed at once, and destroyed by their brother as well. The thought that it was their own brother who seemed to have killed them made his grief for them still worse. He did not ask what had caused the slaughter, nor did he wait to hear anything else, though it would have been reasonable to do so when such a great, and because of its greatness, incredible misfortune was reported to him. He tore his clothes, threw himself on the ground, and lay there lamenting the loss of all his sons, both those he had been told were slain and the one who had slain them. But Jonadab, the son of his brother Shemi, begged him not to give himself over so completely to sorrow. As for the rest of his sons, Jonadab said he did not believe they had been killed, because he found no reason for such a suspicion. But he said that it might be worth inquiring about Amnon, since it was not unlikely that Absalom might dare to kill him because of the injury he had done to Tamar. Meanwhile, a great noise of horses and the tumult of people approaching turned their attention toward them. They were the king's sons who had fled from the feast. Their father met them while they were grieving, and he grieved with them. Yet it was more than he had expected to see those sons again, since a little earlier he had heard that they had perished. There were tears on both sides. The sons lamented their brother who had been killed, and the king also lamented his son who had been killed. But Absalom fled to Jeshurun, to his grandfather on his mother's side, who was king of that country, and he remained with him 3 full years. David now intended to send for Absalom, not so that he might come to be punished, but so that he might be with him, for the effects of his anger had been softened by the length of time. Joab, the captain of his army, was the one who chiefly persuaded him to do this. Joab hired an ordinary old woman, advanced in age, to go to the king in mourning clothes. She told him that 2 of her sons had had some rough disagreement between them, and that as the disagreement went on it became an open quarrel. One struck the other, and he died. She asked the king to intervene in the case, and to do her the favor of saving this son from her relatives, who were very eager to put to death the one who had killed his brother. Otherwise, she said, she would be further deprived of the hope she had of being cared for by him in her old age. If David would prevent the killing of her son by those who desired it, he would do her a great favor, because nothing else would restrain her relatives from their purpose except fear of him. When the king had agreed to what the woman begged from him, she answered that she thanked him for his kindness to her in pitying her old age and preventing the loss of her only remaining child. But to assure her of his kindness, she asked him first to be reconciled to his own son, and to stop being angry with him. She asked how she could persuade herself that he had truly granted this favor to her while he himself continued in the same kind of wrath toward his own son. It was foolish, she said, to willfully add another dead son to the one he already had when the death of the other had happened without his consent. The king then perceived that this pretended story had been arranged by Joab and was his contrivance. When he questioned the old woman and understood that this was in fact true, he called for Joab and told him that he had obtained what he wanted, according to his own desire. He ordered him to bring Absalom back, for he was no longer displeased and had already ceased to be angry with him. Joab bowed down before the king, received his words kindly, and immediately went to Jeshurun. He took Absalom with him and came to Jerusalem. However, as his son was coming, the king sent a message ahead of him and commanded him to withdraw to his own house, for David was not yet in such a state of mind as to think it proper to see him at that time. Accordingly, at his father's command, Absalom avoided coming into his presence and was content with only the respects paid to him by his own family. Absalom's beauty had not been impaired either by the grief he had suffered or by the lack of the kind of care proper for a king's son. He still surpassed and excelled all men in the height of his body, and was more remarkable in appearance than those who lived in the greatest luxury. Indeed, the hair of his head was so thick that it was with difficulty that he was clipped every 8th day, and his hair weighed 200 shekels, which are 5 pounds. He lived in Jerusalem for 2 years, and became the father of 3 sons and 1 daughter. This daughter was very beautiful, and Rehoboam, the son of Solomon, later took her as his wife and had by her a son named Abijah. But Absalom sent to Joab and asked him to pacify his father completely toward him, and to beg David to allow him to come to him, see him, and speak with him. When Joab neglected to do this, Absalom sent some of his own servants and set fire to the field adjoining Joab's. When Joab learned this, he came to Absalom, accused him of what he had done, and asked why he had done it. Absalom replied that he had devised the stratagem to bring Joab to him, since Joab had taken no care to carry out the command Absalom had given him, which was to reconcile his father to him. He said he now truly begged Joab, since he was present, to pacify his father toward him, because he considered his return there more grievous than his banishment, while his father's anger against him continued. By this Joab was persuaded. He pitied the distress Absalom was in, and became an intercessor with the king for him. When Joab had spoken with his father, he soon brought David into such a friendly disposition toward Absalom that the king immediately sent for him to come to him. Absalom threw himself down on the ground and begged forgiveness for his offenses. The king raised him up and promised him that he would forget what he had formerly done.
And we will halt there, with Tamar disgraced and hidden away, and her brother Absalom nursing a cold, patient hatred for the half-brother who wronged her and, before long, for the father who did nothing. The prophet's word is coming true, the sword has entered the house of David, and it will not leave. Next time, in part 3, Absalom's revenge, his long, charming theft of the people's hearts, and the great rebellion that drives the old king weeping out of his own capital and the battle in the wood that ends it. Mind the footnotes, and beware the folly.